Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about airport operations. This is chapter 7 in your book. So, Rod starts off talking about runways. So here at Bloomsburg, for example, we have runway 9 and 27. How do they label runways? They use the magnetic heading and they round it to the nearest 10 degrees and then they lop off the last digit. So runway 9 faces approximately east, runway 27 faces approximately west. These numbers will always be 18 apart just because they're 180 degrees from each other. He talks a little bit about runway lighting, and he mentions that the runway lights are going to be white, so you'll have white lights every 200 feet on the edges. So if you wonder how far, am I from my point, let's say you're trying to land at a certain point and you're trying to say, did I make it? Did I make it within 200 feet? Well, you can use the lights for that purpose. It'll tell you if you're making it there or not. So runways are going to have numbers. Sometimes they'll have lines that indicate the end of the runway as well. Sometimes there'll be lines down the runway. They're what we call aiming points. If you look in your book, Rod goes into some of that detail as well. For the lights, runway lights are white on the edges. Now, some runway lights are yellow if you're going, say, this direction for the last 2,000 feet or last half of the runway, whichever is less. So if you come into Bloomsburg at night, let's say you're going to land on runway 9, you'll notice that there are white lights, and then when you get to the middle of the runway, they switch to yellow lights. Interesting little tidbit. The one where it switches, one side is white and the other is yellow, and then it's just yellow after that. Taxiways are lined with blue lights. I've actually seen some taxiways where they're not lined with blue lights. Instead, they have little poles with blue tape on them. I guess it kind of works, except they're not illuminated. Taxiways will have a solid yellow line down the middle. Apologize, I don't have a yellow marker here. And these lines on the runway will be white. Also, on the edges, you'll have two double thin yellow lines that mark the edge of the taxiways, especially if the taxiway is part of a bigger paved surface. Like here in Bloom, we have our taxiway, and then we have the ramp that goes off like so, and this does this weird thing now. And then over here is the T hangers, and over here is the balloon flyers hangers and such. So the line actually does something kind of like this in the case of Bloomsburg. All right, so when you look at taxiways, one of the things I did want to mention that Rod doesn't really touch on that much, he talked about how taxiways are labeled. So here in Bloomsburg, we have one taxiway, Taxiway Alpha. So that's pretty simple. Now, if you go to a bigger airport, they seem to have two basic ways of labeling taxiways. So sometimes you'll see a taxiway labeled with a letter and a number, and sometimes you'll just see letters. So, for example, I used to fly out of Cobb County McCollum Field, and they had something that looked kind of like this. So this was Alpha, this was Bravo, and this is Alpha 1, Bravo 1, Alpha 2, Bravo 2, Alpha 3, Bravo 3, Alpha 4, Bravo 4, Alpha 5, and Bravo 5. Right, so that's another common convention for labeling. And obviously, there are things that feed onto these taxiways as well. So when you get into the bigger airports, things change a little bit. Now, when you're approaching a runway, there will be a hold short line. This is a quadruple yellow line. So here in Bloom, we have just the one taxiway, and you'll see a line, it'll be dashed on the runway side and solid on the taxiway side. This is a hold short line. What that means is the runway begins here. Unless all of you is on this side of the line, you are on the runway. Now, Rod talks about signage. You will see some sort of a red sign with white letters. That is always a hold short sign. It indicates some sort of a hold line. So in our case, you'll see a red sign, and it's going to say 9-27. Now, if it says something like 9-27, 9 is going to be this way. 27 is the other way. If there was a taxiway approaching from the other side, it would be reversed. It would say 27-9, just so that it would be correct. But we don't happen to have that here at Williamsburg. So, you have that. He also talks about untowered fields, where you have the CTAF, Common Traffic Advisory Frequency. Here at Williamsburg, that is 122.8. One thing about the CTAF, sometimes people will say that's the Unicom frequency. We'll talk more in the next chapter about radio communications, but Unicom is people like BJ at the airport here. So if you need some services, they're the ones you talk to. When you talk to other pilots, you actually talk to them and address them as traffic. But again, we'll get into that. But that's the CTAF frequency, which at an untowered field is the same thing as the Unicom frequency normally. Towered field is going to be a little bit different, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Some other markings he talks about that you might see on a runway. You might see something that looks kind of like this. I'm not going to draw the whole thing, but you have the end of the runway, and then you have a line, and then you have some little carrots, and then you have arrows. This indicates a displaced threshold. You can't land on this side. No landing. So why do you normally have a displaced threshold? Usually there's some sort of obstacle up here, and they want to make sure you clear it. And when I was down in Georgia, they had a displaced threshold on one of the runways. They had a very busy street here. And I would sometimes see guys come in, and they would almost touch down here, and they'd pour in the power, and they'd float just above, and then cut the power when they got to the line in order to be legal. The only problem with that is if a big truck had driven down this road, they would have clipped it. Right? So that's why we have things like displaced thresholds. Sometimes you will see a different marking. You'll just see chevrons at the end. and these will be in yellow. Right. This is not usable for anything. You can't taxi on it. You know, displaced threshold, you can taxi back there and use it for your takeoff, just not for landing. This you shouldn't be on. In fact, some airports, this surface will collapse if you taxi on it because it's an overrun for people going this way. Usually that's not the case in most of the airports you're going to fly into though. But this is kind of a blast pad. It's there so that the jets don't scorch the grass. Often there'll be a bit of a slope on this. I remember one time I was doing some night flying with a student at a country airport in Georgia, and the lights turned off unexpectedly as we were coming in to land. He ended up touching down on this, and because of the slope, it just rocketed us back up into the air before I could get any kind of lights on. So it was a very interesting experience. A lot of airports will have a rotating beacon. We'll talk about how you can know that when we talk about charts later. A rotating beacon is going to be green and white. It's going to alternate green and white. If you see green, white, white, that's a military field, so you probably don't want to land there unless you like to answer a lot of questions. You know, if you're assuming you're not actively in the military at the moment. So let's talk about traffic patterns. So here, Bloomsburg, we have 9 and 27 are our runways, and they both have left traffic, which is the standard traffic. Unless depicted otherwise, you're normally expected to fly left traffic. It's not illegal to fly right traffic, by the way. If you do anything non-standard, you should always be on the radio telling other people that you're doing it. So anyway, let's start with runway 9 and have that in green here. So if I take off from runway 9, this first leg that is going parallel to the runway, it's called our upwind. Sometimes it's called the departure leg. It's the same thing. And you'll fly this way usually till you get to about 500 feet. AGL, above ground level, and then you'll turn 90 degrees to the left on your crosswind leg. And then when you get to the appropriate distance, you will turn your downwind, and in a small plane, you should be looking at about a half-mile spacing. Rod says a half mile to a mile. The plane that you're probably training in should be a half mile. A mile is a little bit too far. Why do we want to keep it in tight? Well, a couple reasons. We don't want to spend extra time in the pattern. What if your engine fails? If you're slow and there's a faster plane behind you, it's going to make them really angry. So there's a lot of reasons why we like this half mile. Now, if you're flying in a Cessna, all the Cessnas, if you look out and you see the runway as you're on your downwind, and you're 1,000 foot in the air, which is a pretty standard traffic pattern altitude, the runway should look like it's halfway up that strut. That's a half mile. Then you know you have the correct spacing. So we turn at 500 feet, then we turn again, flying our downwind. By the way, if you wonder why the 500 feet, they've done a lot of studies, and they found that if your engine were to fail out in this region, if you're less than 500 feet in the air, there's absolutely no way you're going to make it back to that runway. And even if you were at 500 feet, you have to do something pretty heroic, like a 45-degree bank turn that's perfectly coordinated, and come back in and land, right? Which a lot of people would be scared to do. So anyway, that's why a lot of instructors will say don't even turn before 500 feet, because if your engine fails out here, you're going to land straight ahead somewhere. So you come on your downwind, and when you get 45 degrees past the point where you want to land, so when I look out behind me and I see that my landing point is midway between my wing and my tail, I go, oh, it's time to turn base. So I turn my base, then I turn my final. I might do touch and go, so I land, take off, rinse, repeat. Right? If I'm using runway 27, it's the red path here. It's the same thing, upwind, crosswind, downwind, 45-degree point base, final, land. Now, a real common question I get asked, so I'm going to go ahead and answer it even though it's not technically part of this yet, is how do I land? Right, well, how do I take off? That one's pretty easy. Just line up, put in full power, get to a certain speed, pull up a little bit, and then you take off. It's easy. Right? How do I land? Well, if you're flying a little trainer like our 172A, it's actually pretty simple. Typically, when you're a beam, your touchdown point, you're going to put on a carb heat, and your throttle is going to be back to about 1500 RPMs, and you're going to put in 10 degrees of flaps, and then you're going to go about 90 miles per hour. This is what I call the rule of tens. When you get to turning on your base, you drop 10 more degrees of flaps and you knock off 10 miles an hour off your speed. So here, you're going to go to 20 flaps and 80 miles per hour. And then guess what? When you get on your final, you're going to go to 30 flaps and 70 miles per hour. If you're flying a newer Cessna like the 172R, 9 Charlie Fox, it's going to be slightly different. The speeds will be different, the RPMs will be different, but that's pretty much how most people land a Cessna. There's more than one way. But the rule of tens is very popular as far as a method of how do you land your Cessna. You're progressively getting slower, dropping more flaps. Another question I get a lot is, how much altitude should I be losing? You know, a lot of times I'll tell students, go down, don't slow down, because they have a tendency to just get slower and slower instead of actually descending. Typically, on this first part before you turn base, you're going to lose 1 to 200 feet. And the goal is to land at 500 AGL on a half-mile final. You might say, well, how do I do that? And how do I know what a half-mile final is? If this is a half mile, this is a half mile, and that's a half mile. It's called geometry. So another reason why the half mile spacing is good. So, you know, if you know that this is your goal, it helps you a lot, right? Because then you know what you're shooting for. If you're on base and you're like, oh, I'm a little high, all right, I should probably pull out some more power. If I'm a little bit low, maybe I should put in a little bit extra power. That way I'm not having to make all these adjustments on my final. I want my final to be, you know, long. Rod talks about that a little bit. And, you know, stabilized approach. It's actually part of the standards for your test at the end. Can you fly a stabilized approach? Okay, so, you know, that's pretty much how you land a Cessna. Okay, I didn't tell you the exact end of that. Pretty much when you're coming in to land, if you're looking at this from the side, here's your runway, here's you, and your little trainer. Of course, you probably should have your gear down. What you want to be doing is looking all the way down this runway. So your sight picture should be all the way down the runway, and then occasionally you're glancing at your touchdown point, and what you're trying to see is this angle getting steeper or not? If this angle's getting steeper, you're going to overfly that point. If it's getting shallower, you need to add power because you're going to land short. You can land over here somewhere. So that's a little bit of a trick for how do you land and land at the right point on the runway. Of course, getting over the middle, use your ailerons to do that, and use your rudders to point the nose straight. So that ideally you'll touch down in the middle of the runway, pointed straight ahead and at the place that you want it to be. So let's talk a little bit about entering the pattern. The standard way to enter traffic pattern is a 45-degree to the downwind. So the midfield downwind. That's the standard way to enter the traffic pattern, which is really convenient if you're over here, right? So I'm over here, that's easy. Well, what if I'm over here? Okay, now that's not as easy. So let's say I'm up here to the north and we're using runway 27. You have a couple of options. Here are some common ones. You could either cross over the field at least 1,000 feet above the pattern altitude. Let's say you were on a trip, right? And then you can descend, you can fly out, and then when you get to a half-mile away, you can start to descend, and then you can come back around and do like a 270 onto the downwind. That's an acceptable entry. Now, I say 1,000 feet above. Some people will say 500 feet above. The reason I like 1,000 feet above is some airports have a big airplane traffic pattern that's at 1,500 feet instead of 1,000 AGL. So now you're contending with bigger aircraft if you come in only 500 feet higher. Whatever you do, don't be this guy. Don't be the guy that comes in here and then hangs a left. That is super dangerous. I've seen people do it before. I remember one flight recently, I actually predicted that someone would do that just because his radio calls were so bad that I'm like, this is the guy that doesn't know what he's doing. I could tell that from his radio calls. And I said to my student, I said, I bet you this guy's gonna cross over midfield and hang a left to enter the downwind. And that is exactly what they did. So don't be that guy. That's not safe. So again, 45-degree to the downwind is the most common entry. If you're up here to the north, another acceptable entry, if you don't want to climb, is to do like a crosswind entry. Just fly over this way, enter right on the crosswind. As always, you should be talking on the radio and telling people what you're doing. I know that the next chapter is about radio communications. Rod does talk a little bit about untowered fields and their ops, so I want to go over that really quickly. He also talks about things like ATIS. So on the CTAF, you want to talk to other pilots. And it goes kind of like this. The airport you're at, say Bloomsburg. Traffic. Here's a very common error that I see a lot, especially around here for some reason. People will say Bloomsburg Unicom. Bloomsburg Unicom is not other pilots. That's BJ, the nice lady that helps you with your fuel and often makes really tasty cookies and things. Right? That's her. She's the Unicom. Those are people on the ground. You want to talk to other traffic. So it's Bloomsburg traffic, and then tell them what you're doing. Cessna, or Tango, or Skyhawk is even better. It's more descriptive. The more descriptive you can be, the better you are. entering on 45, downwind, runway 27, Bloomsburg. Why do you have Bloomsburg at the beginning and the end? There's more than one airport on this frequency. We have the most popular Unicom frequency ever, 122.8. So near us, we have Danville and Northumberland on that frequency. A little bit further away, we have Wyoming Valley over in Wilkes-Barre. So yeah, we've got lots of people on the same frequency. They might not have heard the beginning of your transmission, and they might get confused. And guess what? Some of those airports have the exact same runway numbers as us too. So it can get really confusing. So, you might call this when you're entering, and then as you're turning your different legs of your pattern, that's a good time to call. You don't have to call in the turn, but it's preferred. So why do we like to call in the turn? It's because when you tilt your wings, you expose a lot more surface area to your fellow pilots, and it makes it easier for you to be seen. Also, sometimes there's a glare that comes off of that, and that will make your life easier as well. So you don't have to call every leg. It's not wrong if you do, but typically I will call at a minimum when I'm turning downwind and when I'm turning base. So I'll say Skyhawk, Bloomsburg traffic, Sky 42 Tango, turning downwind, runway 27, Bloomsburg, or just Bloom if I'm lazy. By the way, when you go into some untowered fields, you should probably know what they call it. Like Sealings Grove is Penn Valley, for example. If you go into Wyoming Valley, a lot of people just call it Valley. They don't call it Wilkes-Barre because then it gets a little bit confusing. So that is entering the traffic pattern and talking a little bit. Other things you need to know about. Pilot-controlled lighting. Whenever you look at a chart, we haven't talked about that yet, you see an L on the chart. If there's a star, an asterisk by it, whenever you see an asterisk on a chart, that means that thing is part-time. Part-time lighting means most of the time pilot-controlled lighting. Now you have to check the digital chart supplement to see, hey, do I have to call and ask for them to turn the lights on, or what? What's the story with that? But usually this means pilot-controlled lighting. On whatever frequency, you have to click 5 times to turn it on. It stays on 15, 20 minutes. 3 times for low intensity, 7 times for high intensity, within 5 seconds. And that's pilot-controlled lighting. I say you have to check the book, because not every airport uses the same frequency for the lights as the CTAF frequency, because they're close to another airport. And that would cause a lot of lights to go on that you don't want to go on all the time. Some other lighting, you'll see VASIs and PAPIs. Pretty common. VASI is 2 bars of lights, and then PAPIs is a single bar, but they're basically the same thing. So if you look at a VASI, you want to see this, red over white. There's a bunch of rhymes. Red over white, you're all right. Red over red, you're dead. White over white, high as a kite, or fly all night. red over white, you're all right. There's a lot of different rhymes for that, right? So that's a VASI. The only difference is a PATHI, instead of having 2 rows, it has 1 row with 4 lights typically, and you're waiting for half of them to be red and half of them to be white. And that tells you you're going to land at the touchdown point, which is never the end of the pavement. One of the last things that Rod talks about in this chapter is wake turbulence. Wake turbulence primarily is going to come from wingtip vortices. And it works kind of like this. You have high pressure below the wing. That's why you get lift. Low pressure here. The lift is from this difference, but some of the air cheats and it goes around the corner here. And that's one reason why some airplanes have things like winglets, or you can get special wingtips. So if you look at the wingspan of your plane, it's not the same as the effective wingspan of the plane. The effective wingspan is less because of this, unless you have Hornier wingtips, but that's a story for another day. So what happens is this air tries to sneak over this way, and it ends up spiraling and trailing. So if there's a large plane coming in front of you, you don't want to get caught in this, in a little plane. I've been in the pattern with a C-130, if you don't know what that is. It's a very large military transport aircraft. It has 4 massive engines in it. You don't want to get caught in this. So ATC will tell you, what to do to avoid this. And I don't want to go into all the details, but the biggest things you should know: you only generate these vortices when you're in the air. So once you're on the ground, no problem. So let's say big plane comes in, big plane lands like this. It stops generating vortices as soon as it lands. So you want to come in and land beyond it. Same thing with the takeoff. So if you look at the takeoff, big plane takes off like so. If you're taking off behind it, you want to take off before this point. And normally that's pretty easy because big planes need a lot of runway to take off. And that is pretty much chapter 7 minus the post-flight briefings. The post-flight briefings have some important stuff. In particular, there's the Lhasa post-flight briefing that talks about land and hold short operations. This is something you might see at a busy towered field sometimes where you have intersecting runways. They'll say land on this runway, hold short of the other one. They will usually tell you how much distance you have when they tell you this clearance. Important thing is no students. If you're flying by yourself and you don't have an instructor with you, you cannot accept this clearance legally. You have to say unable, student pilot. He also talks about some additional lighting. Again, some airports, it's like Christmas. You come in to land there. They got lights everywhere. They got centerline lighting on the runway, maybe on the taxiways. They got flashing lights everywhere. Sometimes it's just crazy. I remember a flight I took once where I landed at a little airport like Knoxville, downtown Island, I think it was. And then we took off from there and we had to go to the big airport in Knoxville. And we took off and I just looked that way and I could see it from like 10 miles away because there were so many lights on that airport. I think I could even see the VASI lights from 10 miles away. It was that bright. It was just crazy bright. All right, and that is pretty much chapter 7.